Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Another Place, Another Time, Chapter 6, Frontboot U-190. On January the 13th, 1944, I boarded the train at Memel for Hamburg. When I arrived at the latter place, I was distressed to see the destruction caused by the heavy RAF bombing of the previous July, which had killed more than 40,000 civilians and rendered half the population of the city homeless. Hamburg was not the only German city that had suffered such devastation, and the German people had slowly become so conditioned to accepting these terrible sights that we actually became somewhat numb. The mood in devastated Hamburg was grim, but the bombing had not seriously affected the shipyards, and at the Deutsche Werft I found several Type 9C-40 boats in the final stages of construction. It was not, however, a very happy time, and I still remember making the daily ferry trip from the east side of the Elbe River to the opposite bank, where the yard was located, with the cold and the fog penetrating my clothing, my breath visible and destruction apparent wherever one looked. My assignment at the Deutsche Werft was as a temporary relief for another engineer officer, but after only a few weeks I received fresh orders to join the 3rd U-boat flotilla in La Rochelle, France. I was happy about this posting, as it now appeared that I would finally join a front boat. On my way to take up my new assignment, I had an opportunity to spend a few days in Paris, a time I enjoyed to the fullest, including of course an evening at the famous Folies Bergère. Going shopping and visiting such landmarks as the Arc de Triomphe, the Champs-Élysées and the Louvre were among the more memorable experiences of my wartime service. When I arrived at La Rochelle, I discovered that, for reasons never explained, there was no position for me in the 3rd flotilla, and I was ordered to report to the 2nd flotilla at Lorient to take up an assignment as chief engineer on the Type 9 boat U-190. I arrived in Lorient on February the 9th, 1944. This port, situated on the southern coast of the Brittany Peninsula, was one of the 5 U-boat bases in western France, the others being Bordeaux, Brest, La Rochelle and Saint-Nazaire, from which BDU had been conducting the Battle of the Atlantic for nearly 4 years. In the summer of 1940, when the first U-boat began to operate from Lorient, it was a large fishing port and a secondary French naval station. By the time I arrived in February of 1944, it had been transformed by massive construction projects into the largest German submarine base in the West, manned by a Navy, Army and Air Force population of more than 10,000 men and women. Lorient lies on the Atlantic at the junction of the Scorff and Blavet rivers, several miles from the mouth of the Blavet. Beginning in 1941, the Kriegsmarine began to build a series of large bunkers, some wet, in the sense that U-boats could float in them, and some dry, in that the boats had to be transported into them. There were 6 such submarine bunkers in Lorient. At the junction of the Scorff and the Blavet was the Scorff bunker, a wet bunker, and about a mile and a half to the west, around Point Keroman, was the 2 cathedral-like dome bunkers and 3 huge structures known as the Keroman 1, 2 and 3 bunkers. Keroman 1 was a dry bunker with 1 wet slip for hauling submarines out of the water, Keroman 2 was dry, and Keroman 3 was wet. Boats were moved into Keroman 2 by means of a unique transportation system. To get to this bunker, a U-boat first entered the wet pen at Keroman 1, where it was positioned on a cradle that was then hauled by a small railway engine along a system of tracks to Keroman 2, which lay inland. This entire process, by which a U-boat weighing more than 1,000 tons could be transported onto dry land, took only 90 minutes and was a much faster method of carrying out repairs on the hull than using a conventional dry dock. The construction of these 6 bunkers, which could shelter more than 30 U-boats, took nearly 3 years, and they were massive structures. The concrete roof of the Keroman 3 bunker, for example, was between 15 and 20 feet thick, and the other bunkers were nearly as well protected. When the war ended, the French government realized it would be too expensive and time-consuming to demolish these memorials to the Battle of the Atlantic, and they can be seen today in Lorient and on the other U-boat bases in France. But the boat bunkers were not the only results of the Kriegsmarine's efforts. Scattered around the naval base between the larger buildings were dozens of smaller but just as strongly built structures, including torpedo, personnel, machinery and administrative bunkers. Curiously enough, the Royal Air Force did very little to interfere with this building project, which rivaled those of the pharaohs of ancient Egypt in magnitude, and it was only after most of the main bunkers had been completely roofed that the British began to bomb them. Repeated bombing attacks in 1943 and 1944 had not damaged the bunkers. At worst, the concrete of the roofs was cratered, but they had caused the near total destruction of the surrounding civilian town. Fortunately for the U-boat crews, we were not required to live in the naval base. The quarters of the 2nd Flotilla lay 16 miles north of Lorient at Lager Lemp, named after the commanding officer of the first submarine to operate from the port. Lager Lemp consisted of a number of plain one-story wooden buildings that served as quarters for the officers and sailors of the 2nd Flotilla, plus administration buildings, sports fields and dining facilities, all situated in lush and picturesque countryside. There was a large pond inside the camp that was covered with a large camouflage net to disguise it, since it was a highly visible aiming point for uninvited and unwanted British aerial visitors. One of the nicest features of Camp Lemp was the Alte Mühle, an old mill that had been taken over as the officers' mess. Completely refurbished, it contained lounges and that necessary adjunct to naval morale, a well-stocked and comfortable bar. Many of the commanding officers of the flotilla had carved their names in the aged wooden beams that supported the roof, and the bar served as a memorial to those that had not returned. Lorient was the home base of the 2nd U-boat flotilla, to which U-190 belonged. It was also the home of the 10th U-boat flotilla, both of which operated Type 9 boats. U-190, my new boat, was a Type 9C-40 submarine which was larger than Type 7 craft such as U-375 and U-612, on which I had previously served, displacing some 1,144 tons on the surface to the Type 7's 770 tons. In some of the post-war literature on German submarines, I have read many negative comments about the Type 9 boat, which has been criticized for being too large, too unwieldy, too complicated and fragile, and for having a slower diving time than the Type 7, which supposedly made it more vulnerable to air attack. In my experience, and I served as a chief engineer on both the main types of U-boats, I found few differences between the two worth mentioning, and in terms of handling, both types behaved very much the same. While it was true that the Type 9 took longer to submerge, this was of less importance than it had been during the high point of the Battle of the Atlantic, as by early 1944 German U-boats were spending less and less time on the surface. In terms of machinery, there was nothing more complicated on the Type 9 than on the Type 7. The Type 9 also possessed some assets. Being larger, it was marginally more comfortable for the crew, and it had more torpedo tubes, a larger fuel capacity and thus longer range, more diving tanks, making it less vulnerable to damage, and more powerful engines which gave it a superior surface speed. Since I made 3 war patrols on a Type 9C-40, I may be prejudiced in favor of this craft, but it should be noted that 14 of the 20 top-scoring U-boats of the Second World War were Type 9 boats. U-190 was a veteran boat commanded by a veteran officer, Kapitänleutnant Max Wintermeyer, a tall and somewhat aloof man. Wintermeyer, a 30-year-old member of Crew 34 at the Marineschule, had commanded U-62 before commissioning U-190 in September of 1942 and had commanded it during 3 previous patrols but had not enjoyed much success. Like their CO, most of the crew had been with the boat for a long time, and it was obvious to me that, as a newcomer without much Frontboot experience, I would have to work hard to establish myself and earn the confidence of the crew, especially that of my 2 Obermaschinisten or Chief Engineer Petty Officers, Holtmann and Krüger, who were not only older than I, being 27 and 29 respectively, but had been on U-190 since its commissioning. As both men were excellent at their duties, I left them alone and did not interfere with their responsibilities. Although at this point in my service in the U-Boot-Waffe I had not experienced much action, I would like to make a few general comments about our morale in the last years of the war. When I joined U-190 in February of 1944, the so-called happy times were long past and we were experiencing what we U-boat personnel called the sour pickle times, which were entirely different. During the early years of the war, U-boats had spent much of their time on the surface, the type of action for which our submarines were actually designed, and usually dived only to escape pursuit or make a daytime torpedo attack. By 1944, such were the numbers of Allied warships and aircraft deployed against us that we had very much become the hunted rather than the hunters. The odds against our survival were getting steadily worse, and we all knew it, yet it rarely became a subject of discussion amongst us. In our minds, it would always be the other boat that wouldn't make it, not our own. The flotilla administration, however, looked at the matter in a somewhat different way. To lighten their burden when a U-boat was lost, before departing on a patrol, we were required to pack our personal belongings in a wooden box and address it to our next of kin. If we did not return, the flotilla simply sent the box to the Atlantis. End of story. In the last week of February of 1944, we began to prepare U-190 for one of the long patrols typical of Type 9 boats. The loading of provisions, torpedoes and ammunition were the responsibility of the two watch officers, whereas I was concerned with filling the fuel and fresh water tanks and ensuring that all machinery on board was operating at peak efficiency. I also satisfied myself, after the boat had been fully loaded and I had calculated the changes in weight throughout the vessel, that it was properly balanced and ballasted. Once this was confirmed by a test dive, I could then report the Techniker or engine division of U-190 ready for patrol. After U-190 was fully armed and loaded, it was moved to the Scorf bunker northeast of the Hirschmann complex. Because of its small size, it had only 2 wet bays, the Scorf bunker was normally used as the departure bunker for boats going on patrol, leaving the larger Hirschmann bunkers to berth returning boats and for work on those under repair and maintenance. The night before our departure, there was the usual farewell gathering at the Alte Mühle for the officers of U-190 and another boat, which shortly would also be leaving on patrol. I include some photographs of this small party, and in my experience such affairs, in contrast to what is often portrayed in post-war films and novels, were rather subdued occasions, not without humor but affected by thoughts of whether those present would ever see each other again. That particular evening, which I remember well, our quiet but competent French mess waitress, Simone, added an even more dignified tone to what was really a very civilized occasion. In the early evening of March 7, 1944, U-190 left the Scorf bunker and, with the crew lining the deck and the officers on the bridge, acknowledged the waves of those who had gathered to wish us well and moved slowly down the Blavet River. The passage down the Blavet to its mouth in the Atlantic was a somewhat treacherous stretch to navigate due to its shallow depth, shoals and tricky combination of current and tide, which required constant vigilance on the part of the helmsman. We arrived at its mouth without incident, however, and picked up our escort of small surface vessels from the Vorposten flotilla that would take us out into the open sea of the Bay of Biscay. By early the next morning, we were in deep water and Kapitänleutnant Wintermeyer ordered a test dive. It quickly became apparent that we had a serious problem. The hatch in the aft torpedo compartment leaked and there was nothing for it but to return to Lorient. We made fast again in the Scorf bunker at 8 p.m. that evening. The dockyard staff worked on the hatch for 2 days and then, on March the 11th, we again left Lorient in the early evening, picked up an escort and headed for the Atlantic. Another test dive gave conclusive proof that the hatch leak had not been fixed and was, if anything, even worse. Back we went to the Scorf bunker. This time the repairs took 4 days and it was not until March the 16th that we set out for the 3rd time. Thankfully, the twice repaired hatch proved sound and we dropped our escort at 7 a.m. on March the 17th, 1944 and proceeded into the Bay of Biscay. For U-boats operating from the bases in France, traversing the Bay of Biscay was always a very dangerous proposition and it was constantly patrolled by radar-equipped Allied aircraft. Since its last patrol, however, U-190 had been equipped with a radar detector that gave us warning of enemy aircraft and we got many such contacts during our Biscaya march. The 11 days it took us to get across the bay and out into the open Atlantic, and we were neither sighted nor attacked. Progress was slow because we only surfaced briefly during the hours of darkness, zum Laden und Lüften, which means to recharge our batteries and change the air in the boat, and we did not tarry long above water as it was extremely dangerous. Thus we crept slowly along the coast of France and then the northern coast of Spain, occasionally obtaining faint hydrophone and visual contacts until by March the 28th we had reached Quadrat CF35, 100 miles west of Cape Blanco. We were now in the open Atlantic. On March the 29th we received a signal from High Command ordering us to patrol Quadrat EU, the area immediately west of Cape Palmas off the Liberian coast of Africa. Accordingly, we continued to make our way south for nearly 4 weeks, passing west of the Azores and Canary Islands. The farther we got from Europe, the more time we ran on the surface using our diesels, usually spending the darkness hours above water and the daylight hours below, but it was not until April the 23rd, just over 5 weeks after leaving Lorient, that we reached our assigned patrol area. In all, we spent nearly a month in the waters of Liberia, Sierra Leone and the Ivory Coast, and it was not at all a profitable time. Glancing at a copy of the war diary or log for this patrol today, I see that the entries are minimal. A typical day, May the 8th, 1944, informs me of the location of our boat and provides the following information. 0634 submerged, 2020 surfaced. Summary of distance traveled: surface 74 nautical miles, submerged 14 nautical miles, total 88 nautical miles. Day after day, the same brief entries appear because nothing much happened. While this is not exactly the stuff of dramatic sea fiction, it must always be remembered that wars are rarely as dramatic as novelists portray them. Basically, they consist of long periods of fatigue and boredom punctuated by brief moments of sheer terror. During the time we spent off Africa, the heat on board was brutal, rarely below 40 degrees Celsius or 104 degrees Fahrenheit. It was also extremely humid. Most days we were bathing in our own sweat, and yet it was a serious disciplinary offense to expose one's body to the airflow of one of the many fans on board without protection of one's kidneys. I am not sure why this was so. The Kriegsmarine medical staff who issued this decree never bothered to explain their reasoning, but in practical terms it meant we had to wear special woolen waistbands all the time. When we surfaced at night, the CO permitted the crew to come up in shifts to the Wintergarten, the platform at the rear of the conning tower, where our anti-aircraft guns were mounted, to cool off. That is to say, enjoy temperatures of only 95 degrees Fahrenheit or so. While doing so, we could smell the continent of Africa which, although it was out of sight, wafted to us on the breeze. I was relaxing on the Wintergarten one dark night when a curious incident occurred that still comes readily to mind after all the intervening years. Our bridge lookouts spotted a neutral passenger ship steaming on an opposite course, which was not hard to do as the vessel was fully lit. It passed close by us, completely unaware of the dark marauder, moving a few thousand yards away on the surface. Through our binoculars we could actually see a party in progress with elegantly dressed couples talking, drinking and dancing on the afterdeck, all the while being serenaded by the ship's orchestra. The contrast between this happy peacetime social scene and our own situation on a tiny steel platform and facing an unknown fate was nearly overwhelming. And so we passed long days patrolling off West Africa. Occasionally, the bridge watch reported lights or smoke, but always too far off to investigate. In the late evening of May the 12th, 1944, however, our lookouts spotted a small freighter of about 5,500 tons about 2.5 miles off our starboard bow and moving fast. We immediately went to action stations and steered towards it at high speed on the surface. When we were within range, Kapitänleutnant Wintermeyer fired a single T5 Zaunkönig acoustic torpedo and then ordered an Alarmtauchen. A few minutes later, our soundman heard a large explosion, and then, as the war diary records, came Sinkgeräusche, Rauschen und Knacken, or the sounds made by the collapsing bulkheads of a doomed ship as it slid beneath the waves. Shortly after this, all contact was lost with the target, and when we surfaced 15 minutes later, there was nothing to be seen except a smoke pall hanging over the water where we assumed our target had gone down. An Alarmtauchen or crash dive might originate from the sighting of an aircraft, and in the Atlantic, this was almost always an enemy aircraft, the radar detector providing a warning that the boat was being probed by radar pulses, the bridge watch citing an enemy vessel, or it might simply be ordered by the CO. Regardless of its cause, an Alarmtauchen was usually initiated by the shouted order "Alarm" from the bridge into the conning tower below and the ringing of a loud electric warning bell. Normally, there were 4 men on the bridge, the Wachoffizier or watch officer, an Unteroffizier and 2 seamen, all 4 covering a quarter of the horizon, and the CO might be there as well. Once the Alarmtauchen commenced, all occupants of the bridge except the senior officer dropped quickly through the conning tower hatch into the conning tower and then through the Zentrale hatch into the Zentrale or control room itself. They moved quickly, as if they did not, the next man coming down would trample them. Once in the Zentrale, the Unteroffizier and one of the 2 sailors immediately occupied the 2 hydroplane positions, and the chief engineer, if he was not already in the Zentrale, moved there and took up a position behind them. The diesel engines were now stopped, the clutches to the electric motors opened, allowing those engines to go at full speed, and the various air intake valves were closed. Other assigned crew members readied themselves to open and close vent and air valves on command. As the last man off the bridge entered the conning tower, he secured the hatch, shouting "Turmluke ist zu", meaning tower hatch closed, before he had actually finished locking it. It was only after hearing this shout, which he had been waiting for, that the chief engineer would order fluten, which means flood, and the diving process would commence. The above procedure was really the normal procedure for any type of dive, but rarely was an Alarmtauchen normal because whatever could go wrong often did go wrong. For example, the boat might be reluctant to leave the surface because of the influence of rough seas, or it might be under air attack, or it might be reluctant to level out from its dive, a problem caused either by the salinity or temperature of the water, or an overeager chief engineer. The possible variations of results in an Alarmtauchen were almost endless. To return to U-190 off Africa, the inconclusive action of May the 12th was the only truly notable event during a long, fatiguing and really rather boring patrol. 2 days later, after spending just over 3 weeks in his operational area, Kapitänleutnant Wintermeyer decided to return to base, a decision impelled by the fact that, due to the delay caused by the repairs of the aft hatch, we had exhausted 9 days of our food supply before we had even set out, and we had not had an opportunity to re-provision. We altered course to the north and U-190 began the long and slow return journey to Lorient. 2 weeks later, we were still southwest of the Canary Islands, but as we neared the Bay of Biscay, we began to spend less and less time on the surface as our radar detector came alive to warn us of enemy aircraft. It was standard procedure while on patrol for our radio man to record all the messages he picked up, whether intended for our boat or not. On numerous occasions during this long African patrol, we heard messages from other U-boats informing High Command that they were being attacked by enemy warships or aircraft, and too often these messages were the last anybody ever heard from the boats involved. During our return voyage, we picked up a message from U-505 of our own 2nd Flotilla that it was under attack, and then nothing more, so we presumed this boat was lost. We did not know it at the time, of course, but in fact U-505, which had been crippled by air attack, was captured intact on June 4, 1944 by a daring American boarding party from a task force centered on the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal. It can be seen today on display in the city of Chicago in the United States. On June 6, 1944, the war diary informs me that we formally commenced the Biscaya March. That, of course, was a famous day in history, and at 5:43 am we received a short radio message from High Command stating that the Allies had landed in Normandy. A longer message came in at 7:05 am addressed to all commanders at sea from Großadmiral Dönitz himself that stressed the seriousness of the situation and urged the sailors of the U-Boot-Waffe to take the most extreme measures and, I quote, to abandon the normal precautionary measures. Each enemy vessel useful for landing is to be subjected to all-out attack, even when there is danger of losing your own U-boat. Every enemy soldier and enemy weapon destroyed before landing diminishes the enemy's prospect of success. In this crisis, I know that I can rely on my trusted men of the U-Boot-Waffe, who have been tried in the toughest battles." End quote. Since at that time none of us were fully aware of the historical significance of this event, we looked at it as just another phase of the war and optimistically talked about the failed landing that had taken place at Dieppe in 1942. We had quite enough to do to survive the homeward voyage and were concentrated on our own problems. Progress across the Bay of Biscay was slow because of the ever-present threat of aircraft, and we spent most of our time running submerged. A week after the Normandy landing, we were still west of Cape Finisterre in Spain when we received a message informing us that we were one of 4 boats inbound for Lorient and that among the others was U-505, which was actually now in the hands of the US Navy. We crept along the northern coast of Spain and then north until finally, at dawn on June the 20th, we picked up our 4-posten escort and proceeded into Lorient. With the entire crew lining the deck as we approached the Scorf bunker, we could see the usual welcoming committee of senior naval officers, various personnel of the Kriegsmarine and Heer from the garrison, and of course, a female contingent from the Blitzmädchen, or Lightning Girls. After we tied up and the gangway was placed, Kapitänleutnant Wintermeyer formally saluted the senior officer and the welcoming delegation, reported U-190 back from its mission, and received the traditional gift of a bouquet of flowers from one of the Blitzmädchen. In a rare show of emotion, I noticed the eyes of our flotilla chief, Fregattenkapitän Kals, fill with tears when he came on board. During the 96 days we had been away, very few of the other boats from the 2nd Flotilla, which had been out on patrol at the same time, had returned. And that is the first patrol of our boy here done, with not much happening during the time at sea. But we have learned a lot of things nonetheless, so let's get to it. Let's start with Werner's accommodation in France, Camp Lamp. This camp was named after Captain Fritz Julius Lamp, who is quite famous, or rather infamous, depending on who you ask. He is known for 3 rather prominent incidents. Number 1, he sunk the passenger liner Athenia on September 3rd, 1939, making it the very first ship sunk in World War II. 112 passengers and crew out of 1,400 people on board died, unfortunately. High Command as well as Lamp himself tried to cover it up, but in vain. Lamp claimed to have mistaken the Athenia for an auxiliary cruiser that was not lit and going in zigzag. The error was only admitted after the war during the Nuremberg trials. Second, he is credited with damaging HMS Barham, a Queen Elizabeth-class battleship. Although he did not sink her at the time, Barham is famous for being one of the few warships whose sinking was captured on camera, suffering a magazine detonation in the process. I will put the footage on screen, it is quite impressive. Barham was sunk on November 25, 1941, taking 862 crew members down with her. And finally, Lamp had his second boat, U-110, captured by the Allies on May 9, 1941. After having been forced to the surface by British destroyers, he ordered U-110 abandoned. However, no order for scuttling had been given. U-110 was captured with the Enigma device and all the codebooks intact. Lamp himself died in the water, although it is contested whether he was shot or just drowned. And speaking of capture, it's U-505. U-505 was also captured with its cryptography devices intact and is now part of the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. If you can, you should visit. U-505 has a very colorful and interesting history, and I recommend you read the Wikipedia article. So, that is it for this episode. Thank you for watching. Consider subscribing and tell me what you think in the comments. I read every single one. Cheers.